800 students right there. And I look at them all and I'm like, guess what? Your SAT scores have no predictive validity. None. You can't, remember, it's range restriction. Mm-hmm. It's like all basketball players are tall. Height is not going to make or break your basketball performance. Same thing applies in a room filled with people with high academic performance. And then, all right, well, what is the predictor? Well, obviously, it's going to be something else. And then we start thinking about, well, what are the attributes that employers are looking for? Right now, it's not technical skills as much as it used to be. Right now, it's like, can this person take feedback well? Can this person, lead a team and people will want to be around that person? I found in my research, for example, that managers and leaders who are good co-regulators, that, for example, during the pandemic, I did this longitudinal study, and I found that in schools in particular, where I do a lot of work, that when a teacher perceived their leader as both self-regulated and who was good at co-regulating. So what that means is that, I'm looking at you right now, I'm thinking, okay, it feels like the world's coming to an end. Are you going to fall apart or are you going to make it? That's number one. Number two is, are you going to be there for me? Are you going to be able to support me and deal with the chaos that I've got to deal with? And what we found in our research is that highly predictive of the culture of the school, highly predictive of burnout, highly predictive of job satisfaction. Frustration levels were 40% lower in schools where there were leaders with these skills. That's what people are looking for these days, more so than anything else, more so than beforehand.
I feel like the word that comes to mind is calibration. And in anticipation of today's discussion, I was speaking to a friend and I said, where are you at with men expressing emotions? And she said, well, I've seen you cry. And I was like, yeah, she said, and it can be beautiful. You hear that, right? It can be beautiful. And I said, but when is a man expressing emotion a problem for you? Assuming it's not outward anger or abuse, or, his sadness, was the example I gave. And she said, if he gets very sad about things that happen a lot, it makes it hard to imagine that how he would hold it together if really big stuff happened. Mm-hmm. And so it's exactly what you described in the workplace, right? Yeah. This notion of calibration. So let's say I'm okay with people expressing their emotion, crying when they're sad, et cetera. But if that's happening a lot under everyday conditions, I could imagine, let's say you're in a work or a relationship with this person and you think, well, goodness, people die, right? I'm 50 now. People die as you get older, more and more people die. That's just kind of the way it works. What's going to happen then? I think there's this underlying question, which is, are you going to be available for all the other things we depend on each other for? And this could be romantic relationship. It could be in the workplace. So I do wonder whether or not people are trying to work out what people are calibrated to. Trying to understand somebody's, I don't want to say emotional set point, but when they're able to, just pack it down and deal with it on their own later, or whether it really needs to become the focus. Just to quickly layer in another example, I have a friend who runs a big scientific laboratory. Mm-hmm. Their laboratory gathered together and did a presentation for this lab director and had created a statistical bubble map of their experience of being in the lab. And there was a giant bubble in the middle that just said stress. And they invited someone from HR. And the whole idea here was to let the boss know that they were really stressed out. And I said, let me guess, you were probably thinking, he came up in a very, very hard branch of science. And I said, let me guess, you're probably thinking, what happened to science? And he said, for a little while. And then I figured, well, this is the next generation. I have to work with this. So they were calibrated to different set points. And I could imagine that's hard across generations, but even within generation, that's got to be really, really tricky. So you're all about measurement, creating actionable tools. Is there a language around this? Is there a way that we can, learn to process and deal with our emotions, express our emotions in a more healthy way? Also understanding of other people's emotion calibration point.
A couple of things. One is that going back to the kind of partner leader position is, I think the confusion that people have, again, going back to vulnerability and emotion dysregulation, is that me being vulnerable or me sharing that I'm anxious or overwhelmed or afraid means that I'm weak. And I think what leaders need to do is recognize, during the pandemic, I never forget this, the university shut down, everything was freaking out. I knew my team was freaked out. They were stressed out about their jobs. They were dealing with being parents and also being employees and working from home and all that stuff. here I was, like the head of the emotional intelligence lab, and like, how you doing, Mark? And I'm like, great, everything's fine. And meanwhile, I'm like, I hate my life and I hate everybody around me. And I had this, my mother-in-law, that story, she was stuck with me. And then I realized one day, like, I'm being a terrible role model. I'm not being authentic and I'm not demonstrating the skill. So I decided to be really honest and say, I'm going to be frank. It's tough right now, but here's what I'm doing. I'm going for that walk every day at 5:00. I can't go to my hot yoga class, but guess what? I've got new workouts online that I'm doing, and I'm doing X, Y, and Z. So the point is that I think vulnerability that's like sharing and like, spewing out all the fears that you have is not helpful when it's not accompanied by the strategy. Mm-hmm. And that's the key, is that I'm feeling this way, but here's what I'm doing about it. That's what a role model is. And that's what a parent needs to do. The parent, has to come home and say, I can imagine this, like you're a dad and you're trying to be a role model for your kid. And here's my dad. My dad would have a hard day at work. Daddy, let's play. Son, leave me alone. Done. Like, that was the end of it. As opposed to, dad comes home. Daddy, let's play. Son, you have to realize, I have to just tell you something. I just had a really rough day at work. I actually got into a fight with a colleague of mine. Didn't go well. And I said something that I really feel bad about. And so daddy just needs a little bit of time to just process that, to just think about what I can say tomorrow to kind of help my relationship. And if you don't mind, I need that time right now. I love you and we'll play later, but right now I'm just not in the right space for it. Okay, son? Okay, dad. All right, let's stop there. What did I just teach my son or daughter about feelings? All right. I'm a dude, I'm a dad who has feelings. I am someone who makes mistakes. I say things that I regret. I reflect on the things that I make mistakes about. I problem solve about the things that I make mistakes about. I need time to, recoup, my energy, and then I can come back and be with you. How much time did that take?
Seconds.
Yeah. But how many of us, are around people that can process emotion that way, that have the capacity to say, I'm in a dark place, things didn't go well, I made a mistake, I feel bad about it, I need to strategize, and then we'll come back and be together. What happens to most of us, we're activated, like I'm pissed off at the person at work, and I project it on everybody else that's, in my next situation. And the power of emotional self-awareness, going back to what we started with, and the power of emotion regulation, is that I notice that there's a shift. I notice that I'm feeling this anger, this frustration. I'm about to go into a new environment with my family. And I know, because I'm emotionally intelligent, that it's not going to be pretty if I don't process that emotion before I move into the next situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to take what I call a meta moment. I'm going to pause. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to think about the best version of Mark, the father I want to be, the husband I want to be. And then I'm going to open the door and arrive through that lens. That's what this work is about. It's what people need to learn.
I'm fascinated by time perception, and I feel like the human brain is so incredible at being in the moment and also getting ahead and thinking behind. And what you're really talking about is projecting into the future in a healthy way, not future tripping as they call it, but in a healthy way. And I think that, broadly speaking, I'm almost embarrassed to say this as a neuroscientist, but the more limbic we are, so to speak, I realize that's not really a thing, but the more limbic we are, the more in the moment we tend to be. And it's harder to get that version of ourselves. When we're relaxed, it's very easy to be like, well, I can remember this time, or I'm going to project into the future. So to some extent, healthy recognition of one's emotions, it seems, healthy expression of one's emotions is the ability to feel, but also split off from the presence enough to get perspective, the time perspective. It's all a shift in the time domain. You're not like, I'm going to go to this, this island in the Caribbean for a moment, although that might be a good, useful tactic. But that ability to tolerate stress and segment a piece of one's mind and emotions and go, okay, that's all happening, and I'm going to get right over here. That is a skill.
So the way I like to think about it is that we have to move from automatic, habitual, unhelpful reactions to deliberate, conscious, helpful responses. Because we become more automatic when we're flooded with our emotions. We rely more on habits, and usually bad habits. And so to build that space between the stimulus and response, like the question always people say, what is that? What do you do with that space? How long is the space? Some people say, I don't need a meta moment, which is one of our tools. I need a mega moment, and maybe you do. Maybe you take 3 loops around the house before you walk into the door to get your kind of parasympathetic nervous system where it needs to be. That is the key to emotion regulation right there.
We had Richie Davidson on the podcast, and he talked about this myth about meditation, that it's supposed to clear the mind and make you relaxed. And he said it's actually really about stress tolerance. You're supposed to sit there and resist the temptation to get up and move. Like, it's really a stress inoculation, which I think is a really beautiful way of thinking about and different way of thinking about meditation. So do you recommend that people meditate in order to become better emotion regulators?
100%. Especially because if you can't be still, it's going to be hard to access the good strategies. It's a necessary but insufficient strategy. I know that we're obsessed in our world right now with breathing and mindfulness, and it's great, but it's not enough. At the end, I'm going to have the difficult conversation and regulate during that conversation. I can't be in my room by myself meditating. I always joke with I opened my book with that story of my mother-in-law, and I would take a breath. It's even clearer why you have to get the hell out of my house, right? So like the breath may help you deactivate, but it doesn't necessarily shift your perspective. That's mindfulness work. And I want to jump in now because I think even taking the moment to recognize you need to take this meta moment is a mindset piece. It's saying emotion regulation is important. I'll be a better version of myself if I don't walk into my house in this angry state and project it onto everybody else. But we've only gone through one of like 8 domains that I think are important. The next is like, you got to know what you're feeling, because the feeling, as I said in my formula earlier, is going to drive the strategy selection. So that labeling piece is really important. And I find that people's vocabularies is just awful. People, I'm fine, I'm okay, I'm upset. I don't think we did this last time, but if I were to push you, anxiety versus fear versus pressure versus stress.
I've thought about these before. So, but it ends up being hair splitting. And then I go into scientific operational definitions. So yeah, anxiety, kind of a generalized state of too much sympathetic arousal. Stress is one, or usually I'd add to that, one or several things that I can pinpoint as kind of a source of that elevated level of arousal. Panic would be if you've gotten so far outside the time domain perspective, like that the physiology overtakes and overwhelms. Like I get into my scientist definition
and I think that's
mode.
Interesting because a lot of people, most people, by the way, say it's all the same shit. That it's all one
Fair.
big, you're, technical. You're like, well, this is cortisol and this is, epinephrine and this is this. And that's all good too. But in the end, what you're regulating oftentimes is the underneath the emotion. And so anxiety, uncertainty around the future, right? I get anxious when I can't predict. That's really what deep anxiety is. I want everything to be exactly the way I want it to be, and I can't control that. So, stress is having too many demands and not enough resources. Pressure, something at stake, is dependent upon your behavior. Fear is immediate danger. So when I give you those kind of what we call in psychology, the core relational themes, the appraisals that are part of those emotions, does it make you see how your strategy choice might be different?
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of, I doubt it's just 2 bins, but I've heard once that, some people need to learn to externalize and or to talk about their feelings more. Other people probably less. I've heard this.
For sure.
I'm friends with a couple, and one of them says she calls herself an external processor. So if something's bothering her, she has to externally process it. And her wife is an internal processor. And so this obviously, they've worked this out, and it's pretty cool to see how they do it. But I was like, is that really a thing? External processor, internal processor? And then of course my gender biases show up. I go, well, you're 2 women. So like that, maybe that language is used, but like in heterosexual relationships, it's different. So, and we laughed about it, and they explained no, because actually one of them turns out to be a therapist. So it's like, no, she has many male, female couple clients. So she's a couples therapist. So I got flipped on my back with that one. The thing that I find that I keep projecting into everything I'm hearing, and I want to put the little asterisks here and say that the reason I share these like things that are happening inside is I like to think that they're perhaps a proxy for what some people are thinking, or not. But is that we really, at least in the United States, we really are not a culture that's clearly defined its terms, let alone its ways of being around emotions. Like, this is not like my dad growing up in Argentina in a certain era where, sure, there was a range, but the culture was fairly clearly defined. I mean, here we've got it all. Like, men expressing anger. Some people call that passionate, depending on what it's about. Other people call that scary and dysregulated.
It goes back to your relationship with anger. And so, we construct these emotions in our brains based on our experiences. So I grew up with a dad who had, pressed lips and red face and looked like he was going to take his belt off and whack me. And so my perception of anger is probably different than your perception based on our upbringing. And that's just, we have to acknowledge that. Now, I could be overreacting to anger, which is not going to be helpful in my life. So I've got to learn to realize not everybody's like your dad. Some people can be angry and not aggressive. But that's the emotional intelligence journey of learning. If I had no cultivating of skills, I would just assume that's anger. And that's not anger. That's one way of expressing anger that I learned. And I think people get caught up in that. They get attached to what they learned early in life and don't realize there's another way. It's kind of why people oftentimes get stuck with trauma, because they are fixated on that experience that they had, and they haven't learned how to reframe or haven't learned how to compartmentalize that particular experience in their lives.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need and nothing you don't. That means the electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, all in the correct ratios, but no sugar. Proper hydration is critical for brain and body function. Even a slight degree of dehydration can diminish your cognitive and physical performance. It's also important that you get adequate electrolytes. The electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, are vital for the functioning of all cells in your body, especially your neurons or your nerve cells. Drinking Element makes it very easy to ensure that you're getting adequate hydration and adequate electrolytes. My days tend to start really fast, meaning I have to jump right into work or right into exercise. So to make sure that I'm hydrated and I have sufficient electrolytes, when I first wake up in the morning, I drink 16 to 32 ounces of water with an Element packet dissolved in it. I also drink Element dissolved in water during any kind of physical exercise that I'm doing, especially on hot days when I'm sweating a lot and losing water and electrolytes. Element has a bunch of great tasting flavors. In fact, I love them all. I love the watermelon, the raspberry, the citrus, and I really love the lemonade flavor. So if you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free Element sample pack with any purchase. Again, that's drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free sample pack. So thus far, we've highlighted at least one thing that can be very useful for emotion regulation, which is some short form of meditation for stress tolerance. Correct. That can give somebody create a gap or an opportunity in a moment to at least take some time and regulate a bit. I'd like to layer on something else, which I'm hearing. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that I'm hearing, which is we should all know our assumptions or our presumptions based on our upbringing.
Correct.
Like, we need to do this for ourselves. No one can do it for us. No single article is going to spell out the full array of ways that one conceptualizes anger or sadness for men, for women, for straight people, for gay people. But this space is actually worth thinking about, right? Right now, there's a little bit of a battle against introspection. This is not introspection. I want to be very clear. That's a separate matter. But this is really just what any really good scientist would do, is to know your assumptions before you Correct. Generate a hypothesis.
I mean, it is introspection.
Okay, fair.
But just like anything, over introspection leads to rumination. And so we're not recommending, I don't want you, Andrew, to be obsessively, compulsively checking in with how you're feeling all day long. That is unhelpful. It's bad.
Some people would say I need to do more of that.
Maybe you do.
I don't. I don't think so.
Emotions matter when they're going to either help or interfere with our performance. That's when we have to check in. Most of the time, thank goodness, they're in the background.
Yeah.
When you're driving, you're not thinking, how am I feeling? It would be weird. That would just be weird. And you don't want to do that.
But checking in with one's assumptions based on our upbringing, I think would be very useful.
That's the point.
And has that been formalized into people love questionnaires. I think if it hasn't been done, I think it'd be amazing. About 8 months ago, I had this wild experience where I realized I had this massive assumption worked into my framework. So I had these friends and I was visiting them and they called me upstairs and there was a bird flying around and it was flying into the windows. And I was like, oh my God. I had birds growing up. Kiwi and Sugar Ray Leonard were like my life before I hit puberty, and birds were my life. I loved birds. And I love animals of all kinds. And I was looking up there, and this bird's just flying into the window. It's not going to make it out. It's just doing immense damage to itself. And one of them said, he keeps flying against the window. I was like, okay. And I tried to get him out, and I couldn't get him out. Really high ceilings. We didn't have the right thing. And I said, I'm just going to open the windows, go downstairs, come back and check. And I ended up going back, and they said, well, is he okay? Is he okay? And I'm like, no, I'm like, this idiot bird is like flying into the window. He's like, this moron is going to kill himself. He got out eventually. And about 2 weeks later, one of them called me and said, listen, I really need to talk to you about something. It's really been on my mind. I was like, okay. And she said, I was really disturbed how you reacted. I was like, what do you mean? I was like trying to help the bird. Like, I love animals. I mean, I really do. I mean, one of the reasons I like doing the work I do now instead of what I used to do is I don't have to work on animals anymore. I hated it, honestly. And, I understand why it has to be done in many cases, but I hated it. So she said, well, just you're talking to this bird like he's an idiot. And I realized in that moment, I was like, oh shit. I was like, if you had said, oh, that poor girl, she's flying against the window, been like, oh, the poor thing. Like she really needs it, and I immediately realized this like strong sex/gender bias that I had, that if a female animal is somehow damaging herself, like, oh my God, help her, save her. And with him, same, if it's a boy, same thing. I want to help. But then my assumption was, you idiot. Like, you idiot. Like I would, and I realized I grew up in a big pack of dudes, and when someone does something stupid, you're like, dude, you're an idiot. Like, what are you doing? But it was actually, to me, it was a mode of affection. I'm sure I upset some people by saying this, but in full disclosure, I just had this massive assumption. And I've actually had to pay attention to that going forward, but I didn't realize I had that really strong bias.
Again, this is all going to that mindset area of emotion regulation. I mean, parents have that with their kids. I can't tell you how many kids, you observe a parent with their son or daughter, it doesn't matter, and the kid is trying to climb a rock. And the parent, because of their own fears, oh my God, honey, be careful, be careful, be careful. And all of a sudden the kid is losing their self-confidence to climb the thing, as opposed to a parent who's skillful, who checks their assumptions. I'm nervous. Okay, fine, you're nervous. Your kid's probably not going to get hurt. Take a breath. And maybe say something like, honey, gosh, that looks like it's really hard. I'm pretty confident you're going to get there. Let me just come a little closer to be there just in case something goes wrong, but I really do think you're going to make it. What do you think that's instilling in the kid? Totally different way of thinking about it. And so that parent's assumption, parent's fears is being projected. If they were more skilled at co-regulating and recognizing my job is to instill resilience in my kid, my job is to help my kid feel like they can do it on their own. Because that's what this work on co-regulation I'm doing, which I think is so important, is this intentional. You're being super intentional about supporting other people and managing their emotions. But the whole goal of it is to support the other person in being capable of regulating on their own eventually. Not codependent, not coddling, but actually instilling the belief in the other person that they can do it.
I love that. I guess what I'd love to know is there a formal process or questionnaire, et cetera, to learning to understand one's own kind of, the word bias is so
yes,
loaded.
There is.
The word bias is biased, but to really parse like, oh, this is how I conceive the world in and around emotions, gender specific emotions. Because I think that'd just be very useful. Because then it allows somebody to do what you just described and really know the difference between helping somebody get to the point where they can manage work with their emotions on their own versus projecting our own beliefs around, hey, this is the way it's supposed to be done.
Exactly. Yes, there are plenty of surveys. Actually, in my book, I even give people a list of them, and you can play around with that and just look at your mindsets and attitudes about them, and you'll see patterns. I had no cognitive awareness that I had this weird relationship to happiness until I did my own exercise. And it was eye-opening for me. And it's actually, I've set goals for myself. It's like, Mark, people want it when they're applauding you when you're giving your speech, let them enjoy it. If they're applauding, it means it was good. Don't be like, breathe, be present, and take it in. And actually, it works. It's a beautiful phenomenon.
The awareness of our programming can liberate us from so many painful things.
Yeah. We spent a lot of time on this, which is interesting because I don't usually spend so much time talking about these assumptions and mindsets and beliefs. We spent some time talking about the vocabulary words, which is very important. You got to be self-aware. Anger is not the same as disappointment. Envy is not the same as jealousy. Happiness is not the same as contentment. Anxiety, stress, pressure, and fear, and overwhelmed are all different. And I know people listening might be like, oh my God, you're overwhelming me. But we have our app that you've seen, the How We Feel app, to give you that vocabulary. And it really does matter. It matters for communication. It matters for getting your needs met. It matters for choosing the strategy. But again, it's not enough. So you got to know how to breathe, and you have to do your mindfulness work to bring the temperature down, to still your mind. I mean, think about our minds nowadays. I mean, they're just, the ability to process information has dwindled completely. Just to give you one example, we used to do like 2.5-minute videos for trainings. People won't get through them. 30 seconds. And this is why people aren't learning anything anymore, because how are you going to teach an emotion regulation strategy in 30 seconds? It's like an Instagram post. Of course, that's driving me crazy too, because so many influencers are, my favorite one recently was this very famous influencer teaching about emotion regulation. And she said, I've decided to throw away my anxiety. And so she's in the car and she opens the door and she's like, goodbye, anxiety. And I'm thinking to myself, like, that door is going to hit you so hard in the face. But yet 3,000, 5,000, 25, whatever likes, and people are like, oh my God, I'm throwing away my anxiety. It's like, you can't throw away your anxiety. It doesn't work that way. The quick fix thing is an issue. Then we got to learn how to rethink our feelings. That's the programming we have to do. We have to learn some of the things that you've spoken about on other podcasts here, whether it's the cognitive reappraisal, whether it's the reframing, whether it's the distancing, whether it's, having gratitude as opposed to resentment and envy. I mean, I never had anyone help me practice cognitive regulation. Nobody ever taught me there was even I never knew there was a thing called reframing. And it's saved my life as an adult because, again, we go in with assumptions about other people too. And if you can say, wait a minute, Mark, is there another way to look at this? Is there another story you can be telling yourself around this? This goes back to something we talked about earlier. We want to be careful about that because in abusive relationships, it can become gaslighting, right? Honey, you're too sensitive. No, you're a jerk. I'm not too sensitive. You're trying to make me feel like, bad about the fact that you're lying to me all the time. Not helpful. And that's also reframing, but it's a form of deception, where another person is trying to define your reality for you. Super scary. And we can do that to ourselves too. We can trick ourselves into believing things that way. Reframing is playing with this idea of telling yourself a new story, but you have to always be a scientist about it. And that's the one thing about all the strategies is that you have to come back as a scientist and ask yourself the question, is this helping me live the life I want? Am I in a better relationship? Am I better able at managing my anxiety, applying these cognitive strategies or these labeling strategies?
I find psychology fascinating. The reason I became a biologist, however, is because I got confused by psychology.
Uh-huh.
And
it's too big of a field.
Well, and the field wasn't as evolved as it is now, as structured as it is now. But I remember thinking, okay, I could see the argument, maybe even the experiment for healthy expression of emotion allows that emotion to move through, allows us to be healthier physically and mentally. I can also probably find a manuscript that shows that for every minute longer we focus on being angry, that our anger grows. And I don't know what the answer is. I sense that's probably not the case. But I just remember being very afraid of the contradictions. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, out of sight, out of mind. I was like, well, which one is it?
Exactly.
And of course, it's both, right? I mean, and that's the complexity of the human mind. So I decided to think about cells and circuits instead. And served me well in my career. Probably in my life, I remain intensely interested in the sorts of issues we're talking about now, including these generational differences. And here's my question. Typically, most work, school, and other environments are hierarchical in the sense that the older people have more seniority and more power. I sense that nowadays, there's an understandable concern and interest in young people's emotions and emotional processing. But I also get the sense from my peers that there's this kind of fear of the younger generation, like they're actually in control. I just got through doing 3 2-hour-long trainings because Stanford understandably has you do like harassment training and workplace safety, workplace violence. You have to learn what the rules are. And I was very surprised to realize that all faculty and staff and some postdocs take this training. Students don't take it. Meaning You have two completely different views of what the rules are. And this is not unique to Stanford. This is unique to a lot of big organizations. And it's not even a criticism. I'm sure, like everything at Stanford, there's a rationale. But it's kind of interesting. You would hope that there would be a universal, at least, nomenclature. Just like we know what mitochondria are here and in Nicaragua. It'd be nice to know that,
I agree.
Anger and disappointment, while those words are spoken differently in two different countries, that there's sort of a basic universal understanding of what emotions are, what they're not, how much comes from our past, how much is about our physiology, and kind of how to work with them. And I'm not saying this is going to solve all the problems in the world, but a lot of the problems that I see out there are misunderstandings about where the line is. That's sissy. No, that's healthy emotional expression. Okay, that's anger. No, that's passion. That person's a narcissist. No, that person just isn't spending a lot of time thinking about their own thoughts. And on and on and on. I'm certain that one of the reasons your work and your colleagues' work is so important is because we need a universal nomenclature. We need an agreement that there's at least a way to understand and navigate this stuff.
This is why the work I do in schools, it's not like a teacher comes to a training and does it in their classroom. It doesn't work that way. I learned this the hard way. It's got to be a systemic approach. The leaders, the teachers, the students, and the parents need all the same language to describe the work we do on emotional intelligence. It makes a huge difference. The superintendent can go into the kindergarten room and have that same conversation. We all know what these emotions mean, and we're all thinking like scientists around emotions. I want to just go back though, because something you said I think is important to address. And I only wish that there was the correct answer to how we should feel and what we should do with our feelings. It just doesn't work that way. A funny story about this. So I'm giving a speech to 1,500 police officers who I don't think were told in advance that some guy from Connecticut was going to be giving a speech for 3.5 hours about feelings. And so I walk into the room. It was like out of a freaking movie. And all of a sudden it's like, and we're welcoming Mark to talk about emotions. And all of a sudden you can see these facial expressions. And like some of them, these guys were people who can't see me right now, like slouching in their seats, like, their guns in their pockets. I'm thinking to myself, what have I got myself into? And so I start, playing around. I'm telling them jokes. I've got to figure out how to meet this group. And the thing that struck me that I haven't forgotten was one guy just stood up and he's like, I'm not sure I'm interested in this. I said, okay. He said, but I do want to know one thing, Doc. What's the only strategy that works? And I said, and of course I'm a psychologist, like, it doesn't work that way. There's many strategies. It's an emotion by person, by context phenomenon. And people are so desperate for the right answer. I think the beauty of it is that it's messy. The beauty of it is that it's a journey. The beauty of it is that it's a process. The beauty of it is that we have to ask ourselves questions over the course of our development. Is how I'm living my life working for me or against me to achieve my goals? And we have to check in with other people, like our partners and our friends and our kids and whoever else and our colleagues. And I hate to say that, but the people who, are dying for the correct strategy, there is no correct strategy. I worked as a fitness instructor for 10 years of my life while I taught martial arts. I saw so many people use exercise as a way to escape their reality. They just went on the treadmill for 10 hours a day with an eating disorder who were just thinking this is, my healthy strategy, and they were ruining their lives. Same thing with food, the same thing with you can trick yourself into believing things. The goal of this work is to help people pause, consider ideas, and then you have to go back and say, how is my life? How are my relationships? How's my work going? Et cetera. And that's where the real beauty comes out of the learning.
I'm checking back into my developmental biases as a way to ask questions that I hope are relevant to everyone, and now especially. And one of the things that I've observed is that there seems to be a broadening of the contexts in which broader ranges of emotions are allowed. Online is a really good example of all of it, right? And I think that the judgments about, well, this person is losing their cool, and someone say, well, so-and-so stepped in front of his motorcycle, for instance. These are the debates that reflect all these developmental biases. And in some cases, there's a legal line. And those legal channels, by the way, are very interesting. There's a great channel. It's a little too Hollywood because the guy worked in Hollywood, but he's a lawyer and it's called The Legal Beef. I don't know him, but he does these everyday cases of like, is someone says like, it's illegal to film here. You can't touch my camera. Or, and he goes, well, that's the legal beef, tells you, and he gives you exactly what the law says. And so I think we tend to like that. I certainly like that. Like where I like thick black lines, clear operational definitions. But it is true that, for instance, growing up, I wasn't of the mind that, it's not okay to cry. But it was definitely certain places, certain times.
Yeah.
It does seem like the workplace and school and online, it's become either more accepted or it just happens that people are bringing more of their own stuff. And I think one thing I worry about, I'm showing my age here, but the one thing that I worry about as people think about their emotions without having really good strategies to work with them is that they lose the ability to be effective.
I agree.
Because time is running. And I hear from a fair number of friends whose kid is struggling because they're dealing with depression or they're dealing with anxiety or they have a cannabis use disorder or time's ticking and developmental milestones are real. And so the question I have is, how should people think about evolving their own ability to work with their emotions? Because you said it's a process, it's a dance, it takes time, with the need to really show up and get things done in life.
Yeah.
Because you and I are two people who are degreed and have steady jobs and we have space to think about this stuff.
Well, we do. And I always tell people that, like, for example, there's a school, I won't mention its name because this is not a good story, post the election, this past election, wrote a note to every student and said, we recognize that some of you may be feeling overwhelmed by your feelings, and if you need to take the day off, it's okay. I almost had a conniption about that. That's my father speaking, conniption. But I was like, I cannot believe this is happening. They weren't a school that I work with. I wanted to call the head of that school and say, like, this is the worst advice you can give people. People have to learn how to live with difficult feelings. And if we're going to give excuses to people to like, they can just like, I'm so overwhelmed by what's happened and not be able to process it and manage it and move forward in their life, we're going to create a generation of very weak people. So I couldn't agree more. And that's not what this work is about. Like, that's the confusion. It's been politicized in many ways sometimes. And there's groups of people now that say, you're making kids fragile by having them talk about their feelings. And it's called emotional intelligence, emotion regulation. We're not letting them like sit in their feelings all day long. We want them to recognize, is that feeling helping or hurting them achieve their goals? If it's getting in the way, you need to strategize. And the goal is to move forward, not to be stuck in. I think that's a huge, huge issue right now. And the same thing with discomfort. Like, it's okay to be uncomfortable. I mean, my whole career is built upon being uncomfortable. People saying, well, I don't like your work. Your program's going to turn kids into homosexuals. I don't want to talk about feelings. You're this.
I'm not a psychologist, but you recreated your childhood with the public.
Yeah, there you go. Sublimated. But, I love that feeling, that discomfort. I sit with it. I don't try to push it away. And I think, Mark, what's your creative solution? That to me is like the beauty of the work. I don't get it. If I just got paralyzed, by that, where would I go in life? I would be frozen. We don't want kids to be frozen. We don't want anyone to be frozen. We want people to be able to live their lives, experience the full range of emotions, regulate effectively, and achieve their goals.
I'm no psychologist. I've said that 4 times. But I have the strong feeling that your martial arts training prepared you to be public facing, because it is a relationship, right? And I'd like to talk a little bit about that relationship specifically, because you've been this amazing ambassador for emotions, what they are, how to work with them in a healthy way, and to also still show up in life, to not necessarily take the day off, right? I mean, if you lose a close family member, we would all say, like, of course, stay home, take a day, take what you need, right? But eventually come back. That's an important piece too. It's an important piece too, to not, as one scientist I used to work with say, dissolve into a puddle. He used to say when someone's paper came back, he said, and if it gets, before you look, if it gets rejected, don't dissolve into a puddle of your own tears. Yes. It was that kind of old school harsh thing, but I think it came from a place of care. Because you're like, listen, it's not the end of the world. And there've been graduate students who've killed themselves on the basis of their PhD not going well. I know stories about this, sadly. You have taken some heat for both being a champion of this process, but also by not giving in to this idea that we're all just supposed to take the decade off.
Yeah.
And so you get it from both sides. You're in a unique position.
Yeah.
And I feel for you, because some people will say, hey, listen, you're teaching people to be soft. And clearly that's not what you're advocating for. And people have also said, hey, you're pushing us to like push our feelings away. And there's a lot that we're really angry about in the world. And how can you be talking about this when fascism is taking over. There's a war. This
Yeah.
and you know, and on and on and on and on and on and on. So, how have you, just personally, if you're willing, how has that landed, and how have you decided to respond to that?
I love challenge. And so, I wrote this piece for Time magazine. And of course, you probably know this, but when you write an op-ed, the publisher decides on the title, and they like to be provocative. So they called it the overreaction epidemic. And I got slammed for it. Overreaction, we're not overreacting. The world's coming to an end. And it does feel like, for many of us, between wars and everything else happening, political polarization, it does feel that way for many on both sides. And I say, yes, but running around yelling and screaming at people, how is that helpful? Like, where is the benefit to you and to the other person to move forward? And so, to me, it just makes me think more creatively about the work I do. And the other side, where people have said that I'm now making people fragile because I'm getting kids and boys to talk about their feelings and